When King George I took over the English throne in 1714, the House of Hanover began its centuries-long reign over the British Empire, ending only with Queen Victoria. Yet, dark secrets lay at the root of this seemingly glorious family tree, corrupting and corroding all that grew out of it. Among its members was the wife of King George IV, Caroline of Brunswick. When she fell deathly ill, she accused her estranged husband, the king, of poisoning her. But modern historians have suggested an even more devastating cause for her mysterious illness. This sorry English tale actually begins in Germany. In 1660, a pair of German nobles, Ernest Augustus and Sophia of Hanover, had just brought the future King George I into the world. As their eldest son, he expected to inherit lands in the Holy Roman Empire from his father. Unfortunately for them, George didn't exactly have the makings of a noble king. The beginnings of George's tragedy and tyranny may have started with his own mother. When he was just a boy, Sophia of Hanover spent a year away from him in order to recover from an illness. This experience changed the young prince. Separated from his mother, people noticed that he began to become sensitive and withdrawn. But in actuality, it was far worse than that. As George grew into a young man, this introversion became something much more alarming. Over-serious and only interested in going hunting or going to battle, one historian called him, quote, adult, unprepossessing in appearance, intelligence, and character. Even his own mother sniffed at him, once saying that he was, quote, the most pig-headed, stubborn boy who ever lived. From a young age, George's cousin Sophie Dorothea of Celle had been raised as a potential bride for him, thanks mostly to her massive dowry. The trouble was, Sophia and George already hated each other, and George's side of the family looked down on Sophia's side as lowborn. But that wasn't the worst part. Right in the middle of courtship negotiations, a teenage George got a household governess pregnant. Yet, for all these inauspicious beginnings, Sophia's money won out in the end. In 1680, the betrothal between George and Sophia was official, with his mother writing that although George was dreading the wedding, Sophia's dowry of, quote, $100,000 a year have tempted him as they would have tempted anybody else. Sophia, for her part, reacted by throwing a portrait of George against the wall and yelling, quote, I will not marry the pig snout. But turns out she did. Sophia and George's marriage took place in 1682, and they settled in George's home court of Hanover. But George was constantly criticizing the etiquette and habits of his lowborn bride, and it was almost a miracle that they managed to have 2 children together, a boy and a girl. Then again, they almost certainly stopped sharing a bed soon after. Instead, George spent his time in much seamier activities. George was now spending more time with his mistress, but this wasn't just any indiscretion. His relationship with Melusine von de Schulenburg was more serious than his own marriage, and Sophia watched as the two went on to have 3 illegitimate children together. When she once flew into a rage about it, George responded by attempting to strangle her. The marriage was now a complete sham, but George still had a trump card. Isolated and ignored by her own husband, Sophia turned to her family for help, but they kept telling her to just accept it. After all, George had a connection to the royal line of England, and, during the political climate at the time, it was looking more and more likely that he would be the King of England one day. If Sophia could wait it out, they could rule together. Only, Sophia was about to have her downfall. Around this time, Sophia reconnected with Philip von Königsmarck, a Swedish count who'd once worked in her household. They began their own affair, complete with secret meetings and passionate letters. Sophia was so in love with Philip and so miserable with George that she even planned to run away with her paramour, until it all came crashing down around her. Eventually, George found out for certain what his wife was up to. His response left a stain on the monarchy ever since. Suddenly, Philip disappeared into thin air, and most believe that George was behind it, having contracted men to get rid of Philip and dispose of his body, likely in a nearby river. He was never seen again. But George was just warming up. Incensed that his wife had cheated on him and even planned to leave him, the hypocrite George quickly dissolved his marriage to Sophia on the grounds of abandonment. Then, with permission from Sophia's father, he locked her up in Alden House, far from Hanover. She stayed there for 30 years and never set eyes on her children ever again. As for what happened to George, you might ask? In 1714, George actually did ascend to the throne as King George I of England. The British, stunned that their new 54-year-old German king, sneeringly called him Lucky George for just how unlikely he was as a monarch. They even declared him the Turnip King, even as he was on his way to Westminster Abbey for his coronation. George was none the wiser, as he didn't understand English and so didn't get the jabs. George I had become very unpopular in England, with people constantly coming up with new insults for him, often spurring the king to move around London in disguise. But the worst insults came from his own family. His son and heir George Augustus, meanwhile, tried to ingratiate himself into British society, claiming he had, quote, no drop of blood that was not English. King George I felt immediately threatened, and the family dynamic deteriorated from there. As you might think, the young George Augustus had never forgiven his father for locking up his mother, who to that day was still imprisoned. He was also afraid of repeating his parents' failed marriage, and he insisted that he must marry for love. So he tied the knot with the capable Caroline of Ansbach, whom he utterly adored, back in 1705. As it turned out, Caroline was the perfect partner to make his father's life a living nightmare. The young George Augustus's assimilation into British culture wasn't just for fun. He also did it as a pointed attack on his father and for his upcoming rule. Next to the Turnip King, George Augustus and Caroline looked modern and popular, and they quickly set up a rival court. King George I was most displeased, and tensions would eventually boil over. Caroline and George Augustus were blessed with 4 healthy pregnancies before entering England, including their eldest son, Frederick. In 1717, Caroline had another boy, George William, her first living heir to be born on English soil. As such, she began happily planning his baptism. Of course, it was at this moment that George I would execute his revenge. The two Georges had years of dysfunction behind them, and at the baby's baptism that dysfunction turned into a massive feud. After a disagreement about the choice of godparents, King George I decided that he needed to reprimand his son. His punishment was beyond unreasonable. He not only placed George Augustus and his wife under house arrest and later banished them from court, but he also separated them from their children, including their newborn son. George and his wife were livid over this separation. After all, George Augustus knew what it was like to grow up without a mother, and at times would sneak into the palace to see their babies. Eventually, the king took pity on them and relented, but it didn't stop the worst from happening. The infant George William fell sick and passed soon after, from a polyp on his heart. The House of Hanover was once more in disarray. Starting late in 1726, karma would rear its ugly head to George I. That November, the still imprisoned matriarch Sophia Dorothea of Celle perished from liver and gallbladder issues at the age of 60. Her former husband was close behind. Just 7 months later, King George I suffered from a stroke and died in June of 1727. George Augustus did not attend the king's funeral, and he had officially become King George II. With the coronation of George II, the House of Hanover officially transported its drama from Germany to the English landscape, and a new mess was on the horizon. See, for all their concern about their children, George II and Caroline had actually left their eldest, Frederick, back in Germany when they left for England, leaving him isolated from his siblings and parents for 14 years. By the time Frederick came over as the new Prince of Wales, history just repeated itself. Just more cruelly this time. The new king and queen, remembering their sweet little boy, were stunned and disgusted when Frederick arrived in England as a strapping 20-year-old with mountains of gambling debt and an out-of-control ego. The feeling was mutual. Frederick, reasonably, held a grudge against his absentee parents and now set up his own rival court, just as they had. Around this time, King George II was coming home from abroad when his ship ran into a storm, spurring rumors that he had perished. Unfortunately, when he finally made it home, he then fell so sick that he had to stay bedridden instead of greeting his subjects. Frederick took this opportunity to start a fresh rumor that this time his father really was dead, forcing the king to make a public appearance while still sick to prove otherwise. Of course, no amounts of scorn could free Frederick from the need to marry and produce an heir. At 29 years old, Frederick married the naive 16-year-old Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. Frederick stayed purposefully aloof from the girl and preferred to spend time with his mistresses, though he did instruct her to snub his parents at any chance she got. Then, when Augusta became pregnant, Frederick escalated the drama. Forcing his poor contracting wife to travel in the middle of the night, he brought them to a remote palace so she could give birth to their baby daughter on a tablecloth. He did all this so his parents wouldn't be able to witness the birth of their grandchild. In response to Frederick's latest machinations, King George II and Caroline of Ansbach banished Frederick from their court, just as King George I had done to them. Their hatred for each other ran so deep. Caroline reportedly once caught sight of her son and screamed, "Look, there he goes, that wretch, that villain. I wish the ground would open this moment and sink the monster to the lowest hole in hell." Again, this was Frederick's own mother saying that, who was also the Queen of England, but she saved her worst insult for last. In 1737, Caroline fell fatally ill with a strangulated bowel, and the news spurred a change of heart in the wayward son of Hanover. Chastened, Frederick tried to see his mother on her deathbed. With Caroline's blessing, his father King George II told him that he was not allowed to enter. Although Frederick later received a message from Caroline saying that she forgave him, we still cannot be for certain that that was the case. Frederick wasn't even invited to her funeral. And even after all this, conflict still continued in the House of Hanover. Frederick and his wife went on to have 9 children together, including their eldest son named, what else, George, which had become a tradition at this point. In the 1740s, he even managed to have somewhat of a reconciliation with his father, the king, and began living a calmer life, until in 1751, a pulmonary embolism caused the Prince of Wales to drop dead. For all their reconciliation, King George II barely mourned his son, Frederick, but he did continue the Hanover legacy with all the pain that implies. Frederick's son, George, would become the heir to the throne. It created an entirely new family feud. The widowed Augusta, now much more experienced in court politics, tried to exert as much control and influence on her son as she could, and was soon locked in a battle of wills with King George II about the boy's upbringing. Augusta was especially controlling about her son's marriage prospects, nixing both his interest in a court lady and a royal match that the king suggested, but they were running out of time. In 1760, King George II passed away, and now the 22-year-old young adult was King George III and was in dire need of a queen. Eventually, Augusta selected the 17-year-old Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, mostly because the girl was from an uninfluential principality and easily manipulated, just like Augusta herself had been all those years ago. As you could probably tell by now, the House of Hanover was as dysfunctional as they come. They never understood the meaning of family quite well. The royal court turned into a viper's nest overnight. Augusta began installing spies to watch Charlotte and King George III to better control them, and nitpicked at Charlotte's etiquette and manners whenever she could. Meanwhile, King George III's siblings, who despised their mother, gossiped about her to anyone who would listen. There was, however, one exception to all of this strife. Incredibly, especially given their family history, George and Charlotte had a very happy and prosperous marriage together, eventually having 15 children, most of whom would grow to adulthood. Although their closeness likely drove Augusta to tears, the royal couple made an initially dubious situation work out for them. Then they faced an emergency. In 1765, the Curse of Hanover struck in earnest. That year, King George III suffered from a sudden fit of mental illness, the first bout of an unknown disorder that may have been porphyria or perhaps bipolar disorder. He experienced fever and insomnia for days, not to mention going through cognitive impairment. In true dysfunctional fashion, Augusta kept the truth from Charlotte even as the government scrambled to pass a Regency Act. Eventually, George came back to his senses without the need for an act, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. For now. 1783 was a bad year for King George III. That year, after the disastrous American Revolutionary War, George had officially given up British control of the colonies. His loss of America is now perhaps the biggest stain on his legacy stateside. But few know he also suffered deep personal losses during this time. In 1782 and 1783, two of his children passed away while barely out of infancy. Then an old ghost came back to haunt him. It's a cruel irony that, after generations of petty interfamilial hatred, George III managed to eke out a relatively happy home life with Queen Charlotte, only to experience perhaps the most notorious mental illness of the 18th century. In 1788, his decades-dormant disorder flared up again, and this time it was all-consuming. With his mother gone by now, it was George's wife and children who bore the painful brunt of it. The king's 1788 flare-up was characterized by intense manic behavior, where he would lock Queen Charlotte and his daughters in a room and talk at them for hours, refusing to let them sleep and going on ad nauseum that it would reportedly cause him to foam at the mouth. Parliament went apoplectic at the news of their king's incapacity, but in classic Hanover style, it was someone within his own family who truly betrayed him. During this time, the king's eldest son, also named George, was thinking only about himself. Raucous and dissolute, the 26-year-old Prince of Wales took after his grandfather, Frederick, and was constantly in debt, constantly had mistresses, and constantly looking for more money and power. So in the middle of this crisis, Prince George kept pushing his case to be made regent and take control of the kingdom over any other candidate. When his father made another miraculous recovery, the prince was surely disappointed. In 1795, Prince George made an infamous marriage. Desperate for a dowry to fund his habits, the Prince of Wales agreed to follow his father's wishes and marry his cousin, Caroline of Brunswick, despite the fact that he had already illegitimately married the commoner Maria Fitzherbert a decade prior. It turned out to be a very bad idea, and soon the Hanover family mess was back in full swing. On his wedding day with Caroline of Brunswick, Prince George drank so much that he was completely wasted during the ceremony, though this didn't stop him from loudly complaining how unhygienic and disgusting his bride Caroline was. Reportedly, they only consummated the union 3 times during their entire marriage, 2 times on the wedding night, once more on the day after, then never again. Caroline actually managed to get pregnant from just these 3 times alone, and gave birth to a daughter, Charlotte, 9 months after the wedding. And how did Papa George celebrate? By giving his wife a truly disturbing gift. 3 days after Charlotte came into the world, George updated his will to give all his possessions to his mistress, Maria Fitzherbert, while leaving his wife Caroline 1 single shilling. Unsurprisingly, by 1796, George and Caroline asked permission from the king to separate. He granted their request, hoping that it would soothe the building tension. He was sorely mistaken. After accusing Caroline of inappropriately entertaining men in her new solo home, Prince George restricted her custody of their daughter, Charlotte, and barred her from moving in the upper echelons of society. Soon enough, all of Britain was choosing sides. It would take a family tragedy to tear their attention away. In 1810, King George III received a final attack on his mental health. That year, his favorite and youngest daughter, Princess Amelia, caught a fatal case of measles at just 27 years old. Her passing sent shockwaves through the kingdom, and it all but destroyed the now elderly, unstable monarch. He slipped back into insanity and would constantly ask to speak with Amelia at all hours, every day. It even got to a point where he thought he was talking to her and had conversations with himself. It led the government to make a momentous decision. In 1811, King George III finally signed a document ceding the rule of the realm to his son, the Prince of Wales, who now ruled as regent at last. But whatever Prince George imagined about the position at the top, it turned out to be far more tragic than he ever could have predicted. In 1817, Princess Charlotte, the only daughter of Prince Regent George and his estranged wife Caroline of Brunswick, perished along with her baby in childbirth. This was a devastating blow to the royal family. But when George found out, he didn't even bother to inform Caroline, who learned about it from a passing courier. The royal line of Hanover was now at the brink of destruction. The next year, George's mother, Queen Charlotte, passed. Then, in 1820, more upheaval rocked the royal family. King George III, clinging to life now for a decade after ceding power, finally slipped away in near total mental confusion. The 57-year-old former regent was now officially King George IV, and it came with a world of hurt. He was a king with no heirs, and George desperately wanted to divorce his estranged wife Caroline. But she wasn't having any of it. It devolved into chaos. In a bid to push the matter to a crisis, George IV put Caroline on a very public trial for the numerous lovers she had taken over the course of their entire marriage. For all the flash of the trial and the ultimate verdict that Caroline had been adulterous, none of it ended up being legally enforceable. So, more determined than ever, George IV upped the ante and explicitly banned Caroline from his own coronation in 1821. But Caroline wasn't about to take that kind of insult sitting down. Caroline tried to get into the coronation anyway, and he mortified her by turning her away in front of all of his subjects. But Caroline, as determined as she was, just kept trying to enter multiple times through different entrances. It was considered an embarrassing moment for the royal family, and this would have big ramifications. On the very day of the coronation, Caroline went home with her tail between her legs and instantly fell sick. To ease her suffering, Caroline took some milk of magnesia as well as some drops of laudanum, hoping to sleep it off and come back swinging in the morning. But like so much else in her life, this did not go according to plan. After a few weeks passed, Caroline came to a terrifying conclusion. She was never going to get better, and she laid the blame down at her estranged husband's feet, swearing up and down that King George IV must have somehow poisoned her and telling all of her supporters. 3 weeks later, the Queen would be pronounced dead. While Caroline's own doctors believed she had an intestinal obstruction that was wreaking havoc on her body, modern experts today think that she could have been suffering from some kind of cancer that decided to rear its ugly head at the lowest point in her life. By then, though, the House of Hanover was in its last throes. The passing of Princess Charlotte in 1817 revealed a fatal flaw in the royal family. There were precious few heirs around. The Hanovers were a thoroughly dissolute bunch, with many trapped in loveless marriages, and none of King George IV's brothers had legitimate children of their own. Let this be a lesson to everyone. This is what happens when you spend generations despising each other. After 1817, the available siblings scrambled to enter legitimate marriages, but the clock was ticking down. In 1830, King George IV finally paid the piper. He perished after an enormous bowel movement, the strain of the work having caused a blood vessel in his stomach to rupture. It was a fittingly embarrassing end for him, and his country did not mourn his passing. As one commenter put it, quote, "There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king." So, in the twilight of its age, the House of Hanover fell to a complete wild card. The next and final king of the Hanover line was George's younger brother, King William IV, who was in his mid-60s when he took the throne, and in a childless royal marriage no longer likely to produce any heirs. William IV was a no-nonsense man who never expected nor desired the crown, and scoffed even at his own coronation, catching flack for behaving, quote, like a character in a comic opera the whole time. With no legitimate children to speak of, William IV's successor was his newly born niece. William's younger brother had managed to have children during his recent marriage. This child would be none other than the future Queen Victoria. Perhaps surprisingly, William doted on the young girl, and brought her up very much as his heir. But wherever the House of Hanover went, family drama would follow. William may have loved Victoria, but he couldn't stand the person she loved most. Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, was a meddling aristocrat in the mold of King George III's mother, Princess Augusta. Knowing her daughter would one day be queen in the Hanover line, the Duchess frequently snubbed William and his wife, and kept an iron grip on Victoria's education. William found his own way to get her back. By 1837, William was in his 70s, and knew that he was approaching the end of his brief reign. The trouble was, Victoria wasn't yet of age, meaning that if he died, her hated mother would obtain power as her regent. William wasn't about to let that happen, and he let the Duchess of Kent know this on no uncertain terms. On the day of his birthday banquet in 1837, he stood up and said that since the Duchess was, quote, incompetent to act with propriety, he fully intended to live until Victoria was 18, so her mother would never obtain the power she so desperately craved. On June 20, 1837, William kept his promise and passed just a few weeks after Victoria turned 18. Although Queen Victoria was officially the last of this line, in many ways she became an entity unto herself, contained in her own Victorian era and laying the foundations for the new house of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha that her son Edward VII stepped into. But from King George I's buried, murderous secret to King William IV's impeccable dying revenge, the memory of Hanover lives on. Indeed, William's last change of the Hanover Guard perfectly sums up everything they were: brilliant, petty, and full of hatred for their own family. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page Factinate for more incredible facts about everything.